Or welcome to another episode of Finance Uncut, where we talk everything finance and economics with an Austrian twist. In today's episode, I want to have a look at the RBA policy response to Australia's economic woes, and also I want to expose a former Fed official, Dr. Tulip, for the economist that he really is. So, in an interesting article today in The Australian by Adam Crichton, he says former Reserve Bank official Peter Tulip backs Paul Keating spray. Now, what's interesting about Mr. Tulip, or should I say Dr. Tulip, he resigned from the RBA about a month ago, but he left behind not the greatest of track records. And I actually did a presentation a couple of months ago where we kind of exposed Mr. Tulip for his, let's just say, incompetence, shall we? And let's have a reminder of that now, shall we? So now this is John Adams, who's a former government economic advisor to our former assistant treasurer. And he says today, this is a tweet today, former RBA official Peter Tulip is an economic nutcase. 2007, Tulip published a paper praising Iceland's financial markets. In 2008, Iceland's banks collapsed. In 2020, Tulip is calling for massive money printing and negative interest rates. Ignore his nonsense. But let's have a look at Mr. Tulip. So you can see this article's from 2019. He, along with Trent Saunders, created this model of the Australian housing market, and he said that interest rate changes, not supply, was the key for house prices. So changes in interest rates were the primary driver behind the movement in house prices and not supply and demand, according to Mr. Tulip. What an interesting name, Tulip, for those who know Bubbles. So let's get this right. Tulip is saying that it's interest rates, not supply and demand. What I know with certainty is that the RBA's own research finds that a permanent 1% reduction in real mortgage rates will lift house prices by a stunning 28%. Okay, let's go with it. Most embarrassingly for the RBA, two of its top researchers, Trent Saunders and Peter Tulip, published a detailed academic paper shortly thereafter, proving that almost all of the stunning increase in house prices between 2013 and 17 was indeed attributable to the reduction in mortgage rates. For the avoidance of doubt, the RBA economists demonstrated that housing supply and population growth had comparatively little influence. Okay, that's what they said. It's all about interest rates, nothing to do with supply and demand or population growth. Oh, what is this? Mr. Tulip, or should I say Dr. Tulip, I'll give him his respect, came out with this report, which you can get on the RBA website, that says there's an apartment shortage and that prices are going to go up. But I thought supply and demand had nothing to do with prices. Anyway, let's read this tweet. RBA is the Tulip, the bloke who praised the stability of the Icelandic banking system just before it collapsed, has now written a piece on apartment supply. The shortage of apartments is most severe in the inner suburbs of Sydney. Oh my. So, one, he's contradicting himself. He said it was all about interest rates and nothing to do with supply and demand. Now he's saying it's all to do with supply and demand. But what's interesting, he's saying there's an apartment shortage in inner suburbs of Sydney. Obviously he doesn't do too much research, this guy, because there is huge vacancy rates in Sydney. Okay, Sydney CBD. Look at that. Tenants in empty city reap $10,000 discount. Obviously he doesn't read the paper as well. Yeah. No one at the RBA was willing to comment, but a spokesperson pointed Domain toward the small print of the report. The discussion paper series aim is to present preliminary results of research so as to encourage discussion and comment. Views expressed in this paper are those of the authors and not necessarily those of the RBA. So Domain contacted the RBA to say, where are you getting your research from? Because, all the research says the exact opposite. This guy has no credibility whatsoever, and now he's calling for massive money printing and basically bagging the RBA now that he's left. So I don't know this guy. I don't mean to be rude, but I really, really dislike arrogant people that think just because they've got a piece of paper that says doctor, that they are somehow so smart. But when they get everything wrong in the real world, that really annoys me. I mean, if you've got a doctorate, albeit credit to you, you've studied hard. But when you can't get things right in the real world, and you continue to think that you're the smartest person in the room, you're an idiot. Moving on, Alan Kohler, who's now jumped on the MMT bandwagon, he's riding that thing home as hard as he can, is all behind Mr. Tulip here. The RBA and government must both say they will do whatever it takes. The article goes on to talk about Mario Draghi, the former boss of the ECB, where he said, we will do whatever it takes. We'll go negative. We'll destroy everything because we're smarter than everyone else. It really annoys me because these idiots, these clowns, okay, they think they're smarter than everybody, but in the real world, they are dumb. They get everything wrong. And it's their policies, right, that impact millions of ordinary people. And that's what frustrates me. If they want to go, use their little brains and go out there in the real world and try to invest or trade in the markets, which they do, and they're pretty useless from what I gather. I'm not specifically saying Alan Kohler here. I'm talking in general, these academic folk. I mean, look at Keynes, John Maynard Keynes himself. His track record as a trader in the markets was terrible. So why would you want to listen to somebody who, just on a piece of paper in a textbook, can say one thing, but in the real world it works completely different. It just really, really annoys me because it impacts people's lives. So moving on, yes, the central bank, the RBA, is going to be doing that. You can see that here, Australian central bank to expand QE and may cut, economists say. So economists are saying that, yep, the RBA is going to really ramp up the quantitative easing and will cut interest rates because the market's actually already under the 0.25 cash rate that the RBA is talking about. But I want to share a couple of two articles before we finish up. So this one from Zero Hedge. Australia just unveiled something worse. Central planning with no plan. And just read this middle bit here. So Australia's government will loosen responsible lending laws in a bid to boost the flow of credit and help the economy recover from its first recession in almost 30 years. The government will scrap so-called responsible lending obligations for most forms of credit that it says have made banks overly cautious and stifled access to mortgages and other loans. Mainly mortgages because they just want to pump up the property market, the property bubble, should I say. The move is a turnaround from the findings of an inquiry into misconduct in the financial system, which called for banks to more strictly follow lending rules. In effect, the government has heeded what became known as the Wagyu and Shiraz verdict, where the regulator had argued actual living expenses should be used instead of benchmarks, which have been criticised for underestimating how much people spend. As part of his ruling, Justice Nai Perum said borrowers can change their spending habits to service a mortgage. I may eat Wagyu beef every day, washed down with the finest Shiraz, but if I really want my new home, I can make do on much more modest fare. Lenders will remain subject to APRA's lending standards but will no longer be monitored by ASIC for compliance. And here's the thing, mortgage brokers come under the new laws called best interest duty, so mortgage brokers have to go through your actual living expenses, not benchmarks. And so you might find that some mortgage brokers will have to say no to you, but then you can just wander down to the local branch and go get your loan. Let's read on this little bit here. Let's put this into broader context. Australia is one of many neoliberal, financialised, consumer debt saturated, housing bubble obsessed, low productivity, low capital investment, infrastructure poor Western economies. Wow, I couldn't have said it better myself. Let's read on. It was already stuck in the linked new normal of low wage, low GDP, and low productivity growth, and the lower quality jobs that come with it, albeit probably being 10 to 15 years behind the US on social and political polarization. Well, that's coming. It is also being hit hard by the cerveza sickness and closed borders, aka Victoria, and really the rest of the country, and by serious trade tensions with China. The RBA has responded with zero interest rates and yield curve control out to 3 years, the latter of which is not stopping the market pricing in more rate cuts next month. As I said, the market interest rates are already under what the RBA's current rates are. The RBA has also said it will be there to support fiscal spending as needed. In short, the government has the ability to expand the fiscal deficit to a threshold determined only by the capacity of the Aussie dollar to hold up. And in previous videos, I shared the Aussie dollar. As soon as it hit 74 cents, she turned around and she's just clinging on to 70. Now, some very smart fund managers that I follow have got trades placed, so they're risking their own capital and their investors' capital, where they believe that the Aussie dollar is going to 50 cents. In fact, one fund manager says sub 40. So there you go. Let's read on. And what is the response? To tell banks to return to a housing bubble. Exacerbating problems in society, making businesses less price competitive, starving non-housing firms of attention, making the banking system even more reliant on global wholesale money markets, and as a historical track record everywhere shows, eventually ending up in bad loans, which will be repackaged and sit with the taxpayer, and making a mockery of the idea of prudent regulation. That is where the fiscal capacity the RBA is offering is going. Along said, when the RBA goes full QE, it will be to buy shonky mortgage-backed securities rather than for a fiscal deficit for mega infrastructure projects. And that indeed seems to be the journey we are on. Central bank financing of fiscal deficits admittedly takes us to the world of central planning, but here we have something worse. Central planning with no plan. Wagyu, Australia. Wagyu very much. And to finish off, economists predict what the nation will look like when the housing bubble finally bursts. Now, just a quick little heads up, I am going to do a video later in the week on the property market, and with that I will bust some myths. As somebody who is a property investor and a global property investor, I have real estate investments overseas in other markets, including the US, and we're going to bust some myths about that, and we're going to have a look at where the Australian property market is headed. But let's read this. A team of economists at the RBA or Reserve Bank are trying to predict what the nation might look like when the property price crashes through the floor, which at the moment seems all but inevitable. Now that there's no real professional reason for office workers to live in the city, now that the government has earmarked billions to rebuild the NBN so workers can decentralise, economists are beginning to get nervous, especially Graydon Costigan from the RBA, who spoke candidly to The Advocate today about where the nation is heading. Our economic growth in the past 10 years has been underpinned by our property market. People who couldn't really afford to buy property were given the chance to do so in order to keep the party going. Now that the music has stopped, things are about to go to the wall. People don't need to live in the inner city anymore. People don't need to sit on a train for 2 hours each way to go to the office. The government is actively investing in technology that keeps workers away from each other. There's going to be a huge crash. The government needs to find a methadone for this property bubble heroin. If they don't, it's going to be the fall of the Celtic Tiger all over again. We're in the same spot. In saying that, it's not time to dig up the polypipe in the front garden with your guns in it. Society won't collapse, but it might as well for some. So here the RBA are saying there's going to be a huge crash and that the government needs to find a methadone for all this property bubble heroin. If they don't, it's going to be the fall of the Celtic Tiger all over again. So what does he mean by the Celtic Tiger? He's talking about the Ireland property market. And this is what I'm going to do on later in the week. I'm going to do a video that compares the Australian property market to Ireland's property market. And I'm also going to bust some myths about the US market, because a lot of people say, well, you can't compare the Australian property market to the US property market, because in Australia we have recourse lending, where if you hand back the keys to your house and there's still debt owing, then you still owe the bank that. They'll come after you for that. Where in the US you could just hand your keys back, aka jingle mail, and they couldn't come after you. Well, find out later in the week. I'm going to bust that myth right there. And we're going to have a look at the Ireland property market, because there's so many similarities between Australia and the Ireland property market. And you'll be quite surprised. So tune in for that. But what do you guys think? So we've got a former Federal Reserve Bank official, Dr. Tulip, who doesn't have a very good track record, is now left the RBA and is urging the RBA to turn on the printing press and to go negative interest rates. And I don't know where he's getting his evidence from for that, but as we can see, it hasn't worked in Japan, it hasn't worked in Europe, but he thinks it's going to work in Australia. But I do think that we are at this point where the free market, governments and central banks won't let the free market work, so they will intervene, and I think they are going to go, as Alan Kohler wants, MMT all the way, and let's just print this thing, because look, it's gonna end bad one way or another. And that's the thing, I'm looking at all the different doors that the RBA and that the government have, and whichever door they open, there's no rosy field in the background. It is bad every single door they open, but I've argued in previous presentations that we should follow Joseph Lyons' policy, former Prime Minister Joseph Lyons' policies from 1933, and compare that to the US policies and compare the results, or have a look at the policy responses both here in the US in the 1920-21 depression and look at the results. I think if you actually look at history, look at economic and monetary history, the answers are there for you. But we've got lazy economics now, and yeah, so you need to be very careful out there right now. And yeah, so happy to hear your comments, what you all think in the comments below. Other than that, stay tuned for my video later in the week on the Australian property market. Until then, I'll see you next time.